Welcome to your
Reforging
Liberation
the
Live.
White Republic,
Dive.
Race, Religion, and America.
And
Ishmael
Lisa
Diller.
with
Today we have a very special guest. She is on the run, and so we got to jump right into it. I mean, she has so many hats that she wears. Lisa Diller, Dr. Lisa Diller is a professor, a preacher, activist, church planter, what else? I mean, of course, and she has a family that's rolled into all of this.
That's right. I have 10 nieces and nephews.
Yes. And so she's involved in a whole lot of areas, and she'll probably bring some of that out in this conversation. I'm wearing my Oakwood shirt to have a little friendly rivalry here. So,
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
So Southern Adventist University is, that's one of our fellow universities in the Southeast. And so we have Oakwood College just a couple hours away. And it's just really great to be here together. And today we're going to be talking about this book called The History of White People. So what's kind of funny is that we have The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, who is a black historian writing about the history of white people. And now we have a white historian who's recommending this black historian's book on white people in a historically white college and university. We refer to HBCUs. So I just thought I'd throw that in there just to have a little fun with the subject, because she definitely has fun with this book, and she messes up all of our labels. And I thought it was interesting. I looked up Lisa Diller because I just saw some different things that she was into, and I saw that this was a recommendation that she had for incoming students at the university, and they've had some interesting conversation, correct?
Yeah. We assign it to our freshmen in our department every year. So not all the freshmen stay. You declare you're a political science major, a history major, and you may not stay that way, so we sometimes have our people that transfer in and they haven't all heard it, but we do our best to kind of get this idea out there in terms of, her main perspective. And I would just like to say that that the United States history is a history of diverse people coming together. As a Seventh-day Adventist in the United States, where over a third of my church identifies as Black, for me to study Black history is just studying my own history as well, in terms of my church and my country. But of course, this is not just a history of Black and white, which sometimes when we talk about race, that's what we're talking about in our country. And there's a really good reason for that, which is the fact that the notion of race, which is what Painter is kind of talking about, in many ways was invented in the period that I study, which is what we call the early modern period, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, as a way, in many ways, to explain and justify and promote the notion of white control over Black bodies. So there is a reason why when we talk about race in our country, a lot of times that's what we're going to talk about. And one of the most important things I think is that for my students to learn is that we clarify our terms. So when we're talking about race, we're talking about bodies and how bodies are interpreted. We're not necessarily talking about culture. We're not necessarily talking about citizenship. So those are those are different sorts of things, right? So whiteness and when people that have bodies, I'm in a body that is perceived to be white. It doesn't necessarily matter what my own identity is. This is how this happened. And Painter is talking about what that meant for some bodies to be perceived as white, what that meant politically and socially, and how the laws went around it. And then also how that got expanded, who was excluded, people whose bodies we would consider to be white today. And it seems obvious, the most obvious thing in the world, that they are white. had a book club discussion with some friends in the city of Chattanooga that I'm part of, and we'd read a book, and it was a lot about Jewish communities in Europe, and the discussion of whether or not Jewish people were white. And she was like, well, obviously, one of my friends was just like, what do you mean? There's a question about that? Like, that's obvious. What Painter's doing is blowing up our like obvious, this is what whiteness means, this is what brownness means, this is what these other things mean. Mostly not talking about the other, but by talking about how whiteness got constructed. So this is when we talk about the other, or we use the phrase sometimes people of color, like we have these phrases we use. What we're doing is we're saying, well, whiteness is obvious. Other things maybe are not, and are exotic and need to be studied. And what she's doing is saying, no, it's not. It's not
obvious at all.
Not obvious.
And so she takes us back all the way to the Greco-Roman world. I mean, so one of the things that was amusing to me, that while Julius Caesar is making war, he's also posing as a historian and anthropologist and labeling other people groups and their supposed personalities and traits and so forth. And how labels were put on other people early in time, and how those labels change. Could you help us with that? It's really funny. It's amusing. I got introduced to it because of you, but you've been studying this over and over again.
Yeah. So you're talking about the way people groups even in Europe get categorized or classified over time, or are you wanting specifically about Julius Caesar and how he does that? Which one were you?
Well, yeah, how it started with him and, just like the Greeks saying, all right, we're the civilized ones and everyone else is barbarians. And then the Romans kind of had that and said, all right, so they're calling people Scythians, or they're calling them the Germani.
Right. Yeah. And what's significant also is that it's not only that they did this, because you can look at almost any empire or people group and discuss their language they use for the other people that they're conquering or expanding over. What's really interesting about this is also that they that those things, we look back on them. So what happens is how that's used later on, specifically in the 18th century, when people become obsessed with everything Greco-Roman. Like you think about all of the, buildings in Washington, D.C., and the same kind of building is going on in Western Europe, where they're like, these are our people that we inherited things from. They're all learning Latin, they're reading Julius Caesar, and so they're starting to utilize these words and this language for other people. And a lot of it's just misunderstandings. They don't even know what these people are doing on the other side, and so they characterize them as being barbarian. And but they definitely, what also got included in this, what Painter does a good job is talking about how beauty and the ideas of beauty get included in this, because the Greeks and the Romans are about aesthetics too, right? So there's a certain aesthetic that goes
all these
along
famous
with
statues that we look at in museums, from this period and from those artists.
Right.
Okay.
Which she would remind us, we're not white. Like all of the buildings that we look at as Greek and Roman, that we have these beautiful white buildings, well, they've been whitewashed over time. And in the 18th century, when people became obsessed with this Greco-Roman heritage in Western Europe, and they decided they were kind of building on it, they saw them all as white, and so they built white buildings, and and whiteness, even in certain terms of the buildings, continues to become associated with things like purity and civilization, and not that crazy color, kind of barbaric, not chaotic. This is what reason looks like. This is what rationality looks like. When actually the Greeks, specifically the Greeks, painted their buildings and their statues, kind of what we would call garishly now, probably. They didn't look great. So what I think almost as a historian is super significant about that isn't that the Romans and Greeks had different ideas about the people who are separate from them, but that what's funny is that when whiteness gets kind of invented as these white people can vote, white people have certain powers, there's all these people that don't get included in whiteness that would surprise us now, including the Greeks themselves. So the modern Greeks from the 18th and 19th century, the people who now consider themselves to be white and are talking about whiteness she's doing a U.S. history, so this is about the
Right.
United States. In the United States, don't want those people joining them, don't see them as quite white. And so even though they want
Or
the
even
Greek
the
heritage,
Irish. So
Well, and
people
yeah,
from an
or-
even more northern climate.
right,
And
right.
so
But they're Catholic. They're Catholic. So part
so
of what
somehow that changed their complexion because they're
well,
Catholic.
whiteness
you
is
know?
not about color
Okay.
primarily, right? So
Now
what?
that just sounds crazy. Okay, so whiteness is not about color.
Right. Because it has all these, it's mostly for power. It's kind of
Okay.
developed for power. And again, nobody is just sitting down and saying, bah, let me invent this way of doing, like nobody invents this wholesale and imposes it on everyone else and tries to trick everyone. These are things, and this is why there's a history to it. Historians care about complexity. They care about context. They care about contingency. These are all things and change over time and how things change over time. So what Painter is doing here is talking about how words change over time, what they mean changes over time, who gets to be included over time, and basically that this isn't just the obvious, clear thing, but that always what happened to the United States is that this even gets invented in this way of talking about things gets invented for power and for who gets to be included in the circles of power. Who's going to be included and who's not going to be included, and where do you draw those lines? That's
Right.
what she's really concerned with. And so one of the things in the United States is being white and being Protestant are seen as similar. So people who aren't Protestant, because whiteness is about rationality, not superstition. And in 18th century, what becomes the United States, as these things start developing, certainly even into the 19th century, Catholicism is associated with people who like tyranny, not people who like freedom. It's associated with superstition and magic, and people care about that. And what whiteness meant, again, in 18th, 19th, early 20th century, what becomes the United States is liberty, rationality, individualism, democracy, people who could be trusted with democracy. More to the point, like who can you trust to make the decisions about democracy? And that's kind of who's being included in this. And so that's why there's going to be rules about who can come and whether they're going to get to be included in all of this. So that's it's the use of language and history and the use of this Roman stuff. So the Roman and Greek heritage really matter, whereas Italians and Greeks, we don't know, they themselves, they've lost their great glories of the past. They're not as concerned with democracy nowadays.
It's funny. My mind goes back to an old character in comedy, Archie Bunker. All right, so you had this show called All in the Family, and it was kind of a dysfunctional family, but it's called All in the Family. It's probably dysfunctional because of the main character is such a prejudiced human being. And so he's white by our typical standards, and he is racist towards blacks, but not only that, he has slurs for Irish people, for Italians, for Germans, for Hungarians. And I'm trying to figure out, well, aren't they all white? But he's talking about them almost the same way that he talks about black people and others. So you still had this inclusion and exclusion, and I was watching the show trying to figure out, well, what is he? Because he's against all these other groups. So it really becomes comical as we think about it when we look at a sitcom. But then, of course, when we look at real life and we talk about the power structure, the political things that you refer to, then it's quite serious. I want to, as we close, I want to give you a chance to just address history and the relevance of studying history by throwing a quote out to you from 1984. Let's go a little bit Orwellian here. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So talk to us about the relevance of history and why we have these conversations. Why do we need to read the history of white people? Why do we need to read Painter's other book about the history of African Americans and how all those different terms changed over the centuries? What difference does any of that make?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think when you know something has a history, it undermines in some ways its power, which can be for better or for worse. I mean, there's reasons why people are nervous about, people learning certain kinds of history because they think, oh, if they learn what happened, it may not have as much authority, because things that just seem natural, on high, even things like, oh, men are like this and women are like this. If you learn a history for how that developed, it makes it seem it's less natural. And if it's less natural, then maybe it doesn't have to be that way. So my theology, the part of me that is dedicated to God as revealed in Jesus and in Scripture, both talks about the ways in which we should be maximizing flourishing and freedom. Now, it's a broken world. It's never going to be perfect. Humans are messed up. Humans have bias and prejudices. We are clumpers. We look for our own kind, whether that's defined by religion or ethnicity. These are things we do as humans. But Jesus has asked us to cross boundaries for him, for the gospel, for loving our neighbor. It doesn't mean that we're going to always completely understand our neighbor. But the study of history, for me, fulfills the biblical mandate of the ministry of reconciliation, because it helps us to learn two biblical commands. One is to love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
And the second one is to not bear false witness against your neighbor. And sometimes we bear false witness against our neighbor because we don't know about the history of how things happen, and we think things are just need to be this way. And anytime you want reconciliation with somebody, someone needs to tell their backstory, don't they? This is where I'm coming from. This is why this happened. I lost my temper. I was sick. I just, totaled my car. I just came stumbling in, and then you came across. I'm sorry I said those things. We give the backstory because it allows us to have what I hope for is maximal freedom in seeing that choices were made. And because of my theology, I don't believe in predestination in the sense of we don't have free will and that we can't make choices. I want my students, I want my communities to know that their actions have consequences. And those are often unintended consequences. People didn't set out to do this, but this is what happened. Now, just because it happened this way, like I say, just because we invented the idea of race doesn't mean it isn't real. So we make stuff up and then we make it real. We invent this idea that what I look like in my body is, or how you interpret me through my physicality, whether I'm disabled, whether I'm considered standardly attractive, whether I have a, face mark, birthmark on my face, whether I'm a woman or a man or whatever it is. We interpret each other through our bodies. Again, my theology says this is understandable, and that we need to see why we might have assumptions that come around that, and that those have a long history for why that happened, but it doesn't have to stay that way. So just because this is true now doesn't mean it has to keep staying this way. We can make choices to act differently. But if I call out what's going on back there, that back here in my primitive brain, why I might be thinking the way I do about things, it helps me exercise my frontal lobe and overcome potentially some of that gut prejudice or instinct or assumptions I'm going to make about person whose body shapes look a certain way, and I'm going to think, oh, I bet they don't have high energy, or they're probably unhealthy, or we have all kinds of ways that come from all this noise out here in our heads that we can then say, this person is the person God has called me to love. I don't actually know very much about them. God has created them as a mystery into themselves. And if I could just do a call out for those of you people that are interested in your Liberation Library and thinking about reading more, and even thinking about the role that this plays in our own church. We didn't get to talk about this book, The Color of Compromise. This is also really a great book. Jemar Tisby is somebody who I work with.
And we're going to welcome you back for that one.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But also our Adventist Peace Fellowship organization has resources. If you want books, videos, speakers, people like that are thinking about rooting this way of thinking about human flourishing and justice work in our own Adventist theology and heritage, because our past matters too, and when you can build on what has happened in the past, it gives you deeper roots. We don't have to reinvent everything right now. You and I don't have to come up with all of this stuff ourselves or reinvent it. We stand on the shoulders of many, many people, some of whom we might call giants, and some are just ordinary people doing their thing that we get to build on. And so I would just also put out those Adventist Peace Fellowship resources to you as well.
Yes, so give us that website again.
AdventistPeace.org.
AdventistPeace.org. I've been there several times. I have looked up resources on there, and I have some things on my shelf because of your website. Thank you for what you do with Adventist Peace Fellowship, what you do to increase understanding at Southern, what you do in your local church, and thank you for being with us. We look forward to talking to you
Very welcome.
again.
God bless you too, Brother Carl.
All right.